Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 127, Jane Getty. Jane Getty was born in Armagh, Ireland in 1782 to William Getty and Jane Ross. Her parents were Irish, but by 1812 they moved to Lancashire, England. William Getty was a whitesmith or a worker in a tinned iron trade. Both William and Jane were convicted and sentenced to transportation for life for counterfeiting coins in August 1814 at the Lancashire Assizes. Their official sentence was having traitorously coined at Liverpool 24 pieces of brass, like sixpences. Jane Senior left England on the 30th of June 1815 on the ship the Mary Ann and arrived in New South Wales on the 19th of January 1816 with Jane and her younger sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth and Jane Senior are listed as being admitted to the female factory under Mrs. Minchin's guidance, Elizabeth being in hard labour on the 19th of August 1820. They're both listed under Jane's maiden name Ross, with Getty written in brackets. Her father, William Getty, left England on the Swan on the 31st of March 1815, and he arrived in New South Wales on the 7th of September 1815, aged 39, so 4 months earlier than his wife and daughters. William and Jane Senior reunited and were living together in Sydney in March 1816. A man committed suicide in their home and they were witnesses in the inquest. Jane said that her child found him, so it's either Elizabeth or Jane Jr. On the 25th of May 1816, £5 reward, whereas on Tuesday the 23rd, the house occupied by William Getty on the farm of Mr. D. Matthew at Clawville Lane Cove was broken into and robbed of the following articles: a brown jacket, a kerseymere waistcoat with yellow buttons, a pair of corded, worsted and cotton breeches, a pair of worsted stockings, 4 pair of white stockings, 3 gowns, 1 white and blue bedgowns, a white dimity and black tabinet petticoat, a black silk coat, full trimmed with rich lace, several blankets, sheets and tablecloths, together with 2 tickets of leave, one for William Getty and one for Jane Getty, together with other property. So judging by that, they pretty much were robbed of everything in their home. Jane Getty Senior died on the 27th of March 1826 in Sydney, aged only 45. 2 years after his wife's death, William Getty was employed by the government at Norfolk Island and was listed as a volunteer mechanic. In 1833, William is recorded as being at Parramatta Jail. On the 4th of June 1834, under the heading of Tickets of Leave Cancelled, it says the tickets of leave granted to the following persons have been cancelled. William Getty, on the bearing, having stolen a bottle of oil in his possession, knowing it to have been stolen. Some family trees have William Getty dying in 1840, although this cannot be substantiated. So Jane Senior and William Getty's children. The first child, Jane, who is the basis of this story. Jane was 10 when she arrived in New South Wales in 1815. She married James William Wilson at St James's Church in Sydney on the 12th of November 1827. She was 22 and James was 5 years older. He was a bricklayer builder. James Wilson was born in Yarmouth, Norfolk, England, and he'd been convicted of stealing clothing, which he gave evidence that he found the clothing lying in a field. He was listed as a plasterer at the time of his conviction. And the transcription of his trial at the Old Bailey states, James Wilson indicted for stealing on the 13th of April 5 shirts valued at 30 shillings, 3 gowns valued at 6 shillings, 2 pockets valued 5 shillings, 1 napkin valued at 6 pence, 1 handkerchief valued at 6 shillings, and 2 pinafores valued at 2 shillings, the goods of Oliver Naylor. Eliza Richards stated, I am a servant to Oliver Naylor, who is an exciseman and lives in Maida Vale, Paddington. On the 13th of April, I hung the things out to dry, after which I took them off the line and put them in a basket in the garden. In about 10 minutes, a man called and asked if I'd lost any linen. I went to the garden and missed a quantity out of the basket, and I found it at the public house. Joseph Hatt stated, I am a carpenter. On the 30th of April at about 12 o'clock, as I went into Paddington, I met two suspicious characters. I met the prisoner with a large bundle of linen under his arm, and another man was with him. I took him into custody. I took him to a public house, sent for a constable. Richard Smith, the constable, said, I found the property part in the bundle and part in the prisoner's hat. I also found some skeleton and picklock keys on him. The prisoner's defence was, a man gave them to me to carry. James Wilson was only 18 at the time of his conviction, and he was found guilty and transported for 7 years. He left England on the Lord Sidmouth on the 20th of April 1818 and arrived in New South Wales on the 11th of March 1819. He was issued a Certificate of Freedom in 1825. James and Jane Wilson had 5 children. James opened up the Travellers' Home Hotel at Upper Gundaroo in 1839. However, he died on the 28th of September 1839 at the age of 39 when their youngest child was only 10 months old. He was working on St Saviour's Church in Goulburn with his nephew Henry, and he fell off the roof and died. So, in 1840, Jane became the licensee of the Travellers' Home Hotel at Gundaroo, and she operated this hotel for 4 years. Less than 12 months after the death of her husband, on the 26th of August 1840, she married George Woodman at Jerrabiggery near Gundaroo. George Woodman was shot and killed less than 2 weeks after they were married, and this is outlined in the Sydney Monitor and Commercial Advertiser on the 6th of November 1840. In the Supreme Court Criminal Sessions, Enoch Bradley of Yass was indicted for the willful murder of George Woodman by shooting him and wounding him in the left side with a pistol ball on the 7th of September, from which wound the deceased had died within 3 hours. The prosecution was called, and John Casey deposed that he resided at Gundaroo and he was a ploughman. On the 5th of September, he went to the deceased's place to plough. Whilst there and letting out his bullocks, he heard a shot fired. This was at about 1 o'clock. He went up to the house and heard a child cry out that George was shot, meaning Woodman. He then went into the house and saw the deceased standing on the floor and one Peter Murphy trying to stop the blood. There were 3 or 4 men and women besides in the house. He asked them what was the matter. The deceased kept saying, Bradley, Bradley, what have I done? The deceased then asked them to take him to his bed, and the witness said to him, George, you won't live long. Have you anything you wish to say on who shot you? The deceased was conscious of his approaching end because he said, what would become of his wife and children? He told the witness that Bradley was the man that shot him. The witness asked him if he had anything to ease his mind. He answered he had nothing private to say, only where his money was. The witness had seen the prisoner in the forenoon, but did not see him in the house at the time the deceased said the above words. The deceased lived about 2.5 hours after the witness heard the shot fired. Peter Murphy deposed that he went with the previous to Woodman's place, the Travellers' Inn. He asked the witness to enter and take a dram. This was on a Monday. Continued in the house for some time till the witness got stupid with liquor. Some time after this he was near the fire when he heard a shot, and Woodman fell down, but he got up again and said, Bradley, Bradley, what have I done that you have shot me? The witness picked the deceased up and tried to stop the blood. There was a man named Edwards present at the time who said, Bradley, you have shot me too. The witness and another took him in and laid him on a stretcher. Someone aroused him and asked him if he had anything to say or had anything on his mind, and the deceased answered, God protect my children, and that Bradley was the man who shot him. He was asked, did you see any firearms with the prisoner on the road? I did not see any firearms with the prisoner on the road, neither did I see him fire. He was certain he saw a pistol lying on the ground, but in a minute it was gone. I could not see who was then present, as the room was full of smoke and in great confusion. William Macy deposed that he's a stockkeeper to Major Barlow. On the 7th of September at Woodman's Inn at about 1 o'clock the prisoner was there, and Peter Murphy and Sarah Wells. When the witness went in, the prisoner was standing in the tap room. Some time after, the prisoner asked Woodman for dinner. which the deceased refused to give him, telling him his place was nigh at hand and he had better go home and get it. The prisoner said he had a long way to go. Woodman told him he would not give him any dinner and to go out of his place, as he did not want him there, as he was a government man. But about half an hour afterwards, the deceased gave him some dinner. The prisoner said, "You refuse me my dinner, and I hope the devil you will refuse your soul in hell." The witness did not hear the prisoner say more, but he was walking up and down the tap room. Jackson and another came in and was sitting with the witness next to the door. The prisoner went up towards the deceased, who was standing near the fire, pulled out a pistol and shot him. The deceased fell, and the prisoner said, "I've shot the man and I'm willing to die for it." In 2 or 3 minutes afterwards, the prisoner asked for the pistol, that he might load it and shoot himself. He then went out, and the witness never saw him till he was taken into custody. He never swore that he was never in the house. He told Mr. Hardy, the police magistrate, why he had not told the truth at first, but then he was not sworn. Did not know anything about the robbery. He had heard that the deceased was robbed after his death. He could not say whether the deceased was murdered for his money. Daniel Jackson deposed that he was a ticket of leave holder and was at the time of the murder living at Gundaroo. On the day in question, he went up to the back kitchen. He went in and saw the prisoner and others in the house, all at dinner. The witness heard the prisoner say to the deceased that he refused him his dinner and that he hoped the devil would deny him. The prisoner then asked the deceased to give him 3 and 9 he owed him. Bradley walked out and then came back again and spoke to the deceased about the dinner. He then walked up to the fire where the deceased was standing, pulled out a pistol from his breast, fired it at the deceased, who fell down and cried out. The prisoner then went out and said that he was the man who shot him and he was willing to die for him. The chief constable asked him about the murder, and he told him that he was not within 100 yards of the place. He was taken in charge in Yass because he said he knew nothing about it. Mr. Hardy, the police magistrate, took his ticket of leave away, but returned it when he told the truth. The room was about 20 feet long. The deceased was standing near the fire. The prisoner drew out the pistol and held it close to the flap of the deceased's trousers and fired instantly. The pistol was a large one, what was called a horse pistol. The prisoner in his defence stated that he was at the place but knew nothing of the man being murdered. He never expected being arrested. He had gone to his master's and never heard of the murder till his master told him of it, and that when he was arrested by the chief constable. His Honour summed up, and the jury returned a verdict of guilty. His Honour, in passing sentence, observed that this was one of the most cold-blooded murders he'd ever heard of. He then passed sentence of death on the man, who heard the awful sounds with unmoved countenance, turned to the seat where the last 2 witnesses were seated. "There," said he, pointing to them with his finger, "there are the real murderers." So it says that Enoch Bradley, a young man found guilty of shooting at Yass on the 7th of September, George Woodman, a publican, was hung. Jane was pregnant at the time of her husband's murder, and their daughter Georgiana was born on the 14th of April 1841, but she died aged less than 2 months old. So Jane has been widowed for the second time and has had to endure the death of her infant, all within a few short months. Jane formed a relationship with William Swan, and she had 2 children with him, William in September 1843 and John in April 1845, and then the couple married in May 1845 at the Christ Church in Queanbeyan. William Swan was born on the 30th of June 1811. He was a twist net maker at the time of his conviction at the Nottingham Assizes. He was convicted of burglary, in particular housebreaking in a dwelling house, and he was sentenced to transportation for life. He left England on the 2nd of December 1829 on the Mermaid, that arrived in New South Wales on the 7th of May 1830. William and Jane lived in Irishtown on the Dodsworth estate in March 1849, where they had their 4th and last child, Frances Elizabeth, known as Fanny. William Swan then purchased a house at Queanbeyan on the 14th of September 1852. The cottage was still standing in the 1980s, which was on the corner of Atkinson and Waniassa Streets in Queanbeyan. On the 13th of July 1856, he sold the property to William James Wilson, his wife's son by her first marriage, for the sum of £55. At the time of the sale, William James was a coach proprietor in Goulburn. It is unsure whether he actually lived in the home or whether he purchased the home for his mother and her family to reside there. One possible reason is that William Wilson bought the property as his stepfather, William Swan, was affected by financial difficulties at some stage. And it's quite possible that William James Wilson was in a financial position to purchase the home in order for the Swan family to continue living in the home and get much needed cash. Jane Swan certainly lived in this home with her youngest daughter Frances and a granddaughter, as there was evidence of this when the Queanbeyan River broke its banks and flooded the home on the night of the 25th and 26th of April 1870. At the time, her husband William was away working as a sawyer, possibly around Hoskingtown. The little granddaughter raised the alarm. She woke her grandmother up and her aunt, saying that her bedclothes were wet. Jane Swan at first thought the roof was leaking, but upon getting up, she was standing in water level equal with her bed. Realising the predicament they were in, Jane, Frances, and the little granddaughter escaped for their lives through the back door to the rising ground behind. Such was the danger that they could not spare the time to save or protect any of their possessions. The Swans were only able to move back into their home about a fortnight later on the 12th of May, but on that very day, torrential rain again began to fall in the town. Seeing that another flood threatened, they abandoned the house on the same day, this time being able to take some household goods with them. It was after these two floods that Jane Swan, who was nearly 60 years old at this time, moved the house brick by brick to a higher position on the land allotment. Jane Swan continued to live in the house for many years after those dramatic events in 1870. In 1885, the home was owned by her daughter Frances, with Jane living in it. The situation remained the same until the assessment of 1889, when Jane Swan was actually listed as the owner and occupier of the property. Jane continued to live in the old cottage that she dwelt in till she passed away on the 27th of June 1893 at the age of 88. William had died previously on the 15th of December 1883. At that point, the two adjoining dwellings were combined into one for ratings purposes, as Frances and her husband Thomas Penny owned the adjacent property. In 1923, the ownership of the Atkinson Street property was passed on to Albert Ernest, known as Ern Swan, who was the grandson of Jane Swan through her son Richard. Ern Swan was born and lived all his life in the Queanbeyan district. He mainly earned his living as a grazier, but he also operated a butcher's shop. He retained the Atkinson Street property for over 20 years, but it seems unlikely that he and his wife actually lived in the home. William and Jane's marriage resulted in the establishment of a large and well-known family in Queanbeyan. So Jane's descendants were Jane and James Wilson's children. The first child mentioned earlier was William James Wilson. He was born in Goulburn, New South Wales in about 1829, and he bought the cottage in Atkinson Street in July 1856 and died in Goulburn in 1888. The second child, Thomas, was born in Sydney in 1834. He married Emma Gibbs in Queanbeyan in 1862 when he was 28 and Emma was 20. They had 9 children, and Thomas died in Queanbeyan in about 1887 at the age of 53. The third child was Henry Wilson. He was born on the 7th of March 1836 in Sydney. He married Mary Davis at Yass on the 4th of October 1858. They had 13 children with 9 surviving infancy, and he died at the property Geddington at Yass on the 29th of January 1910 at the age of 73. The fourth child was Charles Wilson. He was born in 1838 in Goulburn. He married Margaret Flint at Queanbeyan in 1864 when he was 26 and Margaret 19. They had 8 children, and Charles died in November 1881 in Queanbeyan, aged only 43. Angelina Wilson, known as Ellen, was born in Sydney in 1831. She married John Hunt in Queanbeyan in 1848. They had 5 children together, but John Hunt died in 1857, the year their youngest child was born. Ellen then went on to marry Jonathan Nelson Woodman in 1859 in Queanbeyan and had a further 5 children with him. Ellen died in 1900, aged 69. And Jane and William Swan's children. Their first child, William Jr., was born in Gundaroo in September 1843. He was 5 when he was baptised, owing to his parents' marriage. In 1863, at the age of 20, he was jailed in Darlinghurst for being caught with obtaining a horse by false pretences in Queanbeyan. He was a sawyer at the time of his conviction. He married Mary Ann Peniston in Queanbeyan in 1870. However, his wife died in childbirth. His son, William Jr., survived. However, he died at the age of only 48, leaving behind a wife, Emma Fegan, and a daughter who was 9. In the Queanbeyan Age and Queanbeyan Observer on the 14th of January 1919, it talks about a railway fatality. Near Cook's Cutting, an inquiry into the circumstances of the death of William Samuel Swan was held at the courthouse in Goulburn on Saturday afternoon. Inspector Johnston appeared on behalf of the Railway Department and Mr Thomas for the widow and relatives of the deceased. LHC Swan, attendant at the Kenmore Mental Hospital, deposed of viewing the body of the deceased, who was a stepbrother of the witness. Deceased was born at Queanbeyan. He was 47, a married man, and the deceased's wife and children usually resided at Queanbeyan. The deceased left no property and his life was not insured. The witness never saw the deceased worse for liquor. P.J. Kelly, relieving railway officer, deposed that the body of a man was brought to Queanbeyan on the train at 9:20 on the 9th of January. Yeamans, the driver of the train, said he had run over a man and asked the witness if a man had left Queanbeyan on a tricycle. The witness looked at the body and recognised that it was of a man who had spoken to him about 2 hours before, but the witness did not know the deceased's name. The deceased inquired about a train, then at Queanbeyan, and it was a special goods train which was going to Harden. The deceased asked if there were any trains on the up road, that is the line from Harden, and the witness replied that he expected a train in 10 minutes' time. The deceased replied, "I think I had better get on down the road." The deceased left. The witness did not see the deceased on a tricycle. The deceased was sober when speaking to the witness. James J. Yeamans, engine driver on the railway residing at Harden, deposed that at 8:30 p.m. on the 9th of January, he was driving a goods train from Goulburn to Harden. He left Cook's Cutting at 8:27 p.m, and after going a mile and a half, he noticed sparks flying from the front of the engine. Thinking that some of the rods had fallen, the witness stopped the engine and found a pipe dragging on the ballast. On the left guard iron of the engine, he noticed a slight mark and what he thought to be a spot of blood. Witness and the fireman walked along the line about 50 yards and found a tricycle wheel. About 100 yards beyond the brake van, the witness found the body of the deceased lying in water alongside a viaduct. Witness and his mate took the body from the water and tried to resuscitate it. Witness was travelling at a rate of 20 to 25 miles per hour. The body was taken to Queanbeyan. The witness could not see a tricycle on the line for a greater distance than 15 yards, and the viaduct was 2 miles from Queanbeyan. The whole train went over the tricycle. The line was perfectly straight at the spot. In an emergency case, the witness could pull up a train in its own length of about 300 yards. Even if the witness had seen the deceased, he could not have pulled up in 15 yards. The headlight was burning on the engine. Sydney Steele, the sub-inspector in the railway department, identified the body of the deceased, who was a painter, in the signal branch of the railways on the 9th of January at 11 a.m, and the witness saw the deceased painting a signal post at Cook's Cutting. Painters often rode tricycles from job to job. John Stanley Black, the railway fireman, corroborated the evidence of James Yeamans. In answer, the witness said a person coming from Queanbeyan on a tricycle could have seen the engine headlight 2.5 miles away. A verdict of accidental death was recorded. The remains of the unfortunate victim of the accident were brought to Queanbeyan and taken to the Christ Church, and the funeral took place on Sunday afternoon and was attended by a large number of relatives and friends of the deceased. And on the 16th of January 1919, it says, from a Goulburn paper, we get further particulars of the Queanbeyan railway man, William Samuel Swan, who was killed on the railway. It transpires that he was riding a tricycle on the railway at the time of the accident, being a mile from Cook's Cutting. It is supposed that he had gone to Queanbeyan for provisions and was returning. He was run down on a bridge. He was picked up by those in charge of the train, which was on its way to Harden, and was taken to Queanbeyan, where it was found that his right arm and left leg had been broken and his skull fractured. The deceased is survived by his widow and one daughter. A brother and other relatives reside in Goulburn. And William Samuel Swan's father, William, after the death of his wife in childbirth, he remarried and had a further 6 children, and he died on the 7th of December 1911 in Redfern, New South Wales, aged 68. The second child of Jane and William Swan was John. He was born on the 4th of April 1845 in Queanbeyan. He married Margaret Brown on the 20th of January 1876 at Queanbeyan. He was a farmer and they had 7 children, and he died in February 1891 at the age of only 45. And it's stated on his probate jurisdiction that he was a farmer late of Copperfield, Queanbeyan. The third child was Richard Alfred Swan, and he was born on the 2nd of September 1847 in Queanbeyan. He married Jane Sims on the 27th of May 1869. They had 11 children, and he died on the 15th of February 1902. In his probate jurisdiction, it states that he was generally known as Richard Swan, late of Stony Creek near Queanbeyan, Grazier. And he left his will to Alfred Edward Swan and Thomas Penny. Alfred Edward, that was mentioned in the will, was his oldest surviving son, and Thomas Penny, his brother-in-law. The fourth child was Frances Elizabeth Swan. She was the daughter that was mentioned before in the flooding incident, and she was born in 1849. On the 19th of March 1874, Frances married Edwin Land, an Englishman. Edward Land arrived in Sydney on the 7th of March 1842 per Palestine. In 1855 he came to Queanbeyan and was an overseer, and he was also an innkeeper at the Lands Victoria Hotel at Queanbeyan. He also resided at Tharwa, Queanbeyan, and at Lanyon, Avoca, near Juggiong. He firstly married Maria Jane Webber in 1855 in the Christchurch at Queanbeyan, and he had 7 children with his first wife. And then, as mentioned, he married Frances Elizabeth Swan at the St John's Church in Queanbeyan in 1874. A daughter was born, and then in 1858, Edwin's second child and only son, Edwin Henry Land, was born. Land's Victoria Hotel was licensed in 1867, and it was a landmark in Queanbeyan for over a century on the corner of Collett and Monaro Street. And it passed on to Edwin's son, Edwin, who was 26 after his father's death in May 1884. So after Edward Land's death, Frances remarried on the 29th of June 1885 to Thomas Penny. The Penny family had originally been slaughtermen with paddocks on the northeastern side of Yass Road. Thomas Penny, however, had been born in Bungendore in 1844 and followed up a more genteel occupation, operating a fruit and lolly store in the corner of Monaro and Crawford Streets. Shortly after Thomas and Frances were married, it lists Mrs. Penny as the owner of the Atkins Street property and her mother Jane as the occupant. The Pennys resided in twin houses side by side for the next 30 years. Thomas Penny died in July 1922, and about a year later, Frances moved into the house of her niece, Mrs. H.A. Taylor, William Samuel Swan's daughter, in Park Street, and Frances Penny died in November 1931. She had no children. And Jane Getty's family, Elizabeth, the sister that came out with her, she was born on the 28th of February 1812 at County Armour, Ireland, and she was 7 years younger than her sister Jane. In the 1828 census, Elizabeth is 16 and she's listed as a servant for David Cooper at South Hand Road, Sydney. On the 24th of May 1853, Elizabeth Getty is listed under the heading of Lovers of Strong Drink. The following drunkards were placed before the mayor on Thursday at the City Police Court and fined 20 shillings. And Elizabeth was amongst them. There was also an Elizabeth Getty that was mentioned in the South Australian Register in Adelaide on the 16th of November 1894. It says in Adelaide, 3 women, Elizabeth Getty, Kate Stanton and Nora O'Loughlin, were charged with being idle and disorderly persons. Detectives McKinnon and Jones said all the defendants were very bad characters, stated that they had habitually consorted with reputed thieves and the lowest characters, Chinese and black men. He and Stanton were each sent to jail for 1 month. There is a record of an Elizabeth Getty dying in Victoria in 1857 at the age of only 49. However, this would have made her birth year as early as 1808, not 1812. So I'm unable to work out whether this was Jane's Elizabeth Getty that died in 1857, or was it this other Elizabeth Getty who was found in Adelaide. So she ends up being a little bit of a mystery. So after being the child of convicts, She certainly had a pretty difficult life, widowed 3 times and having to endure floods and a death of an infant. However, her legacy lives on with the many descendants.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.